In my last Dawlish T Wall video, I built most of the railway base. There's still some base work to do on the southwest part of the layout, but I was keen to do some track laying. Although these T-gauge trains are tiny, their motors are still pretty noisy, so I decided I'd still put cork down for a bit of insulation. I've also found that Copydex glue sticks track to cork very reliably in N-gauge. With this railway I tried some self-adhesive cork. It was very easy to lay and stuck strongly to the base. It was a lot quicker than using Copydex or PVA and didn't need any drying time. Win-win. I made some nice neat lines at a consistent distance from the edge of the curved base to show where the track bed should go, and to guide the track laying. The gap to the edge is for the footpath. When I came to fettling a piece of flexitrack along that line, I didn't like how the profile of the curve looked. It didn't start with a straight bit at the edge of the board. I then remembered this curve was cut before I decided to make this end of the layout shorter, which I talked about in my first video about the base. I also realised I'd miscalculated the width of the track bed when drawing the second line. I'd drawn it too close to the first. So the lines I'd drawn were useless and I needed to just go by eye with what seemed good. I needed to temporarily pin the end of the track down to make sure that part stayed square with the base, and to start with tried narrow Pico N-gauge track pins. As usual, they had a severe aversion to being hammered into wood and just bent. So a bit of searching on eBay and several days later I had some 0.5mm diameter screws. These were the narrowest I could find that were already in the UK. Most of the search results for tiny screws would take weeks to arrive from China. These ones are only 3mm long, but with the sleepers and cork that's only just long enough to bite into the plywood. I drilled pilot holes for the screws, but in the cork the tiny holes become indistinguishable from cracks in the cork, so it took a while to find them. But once the screws were in, they did a good job of holding the track in place. I also put a screw at about the midpoint of the curve where it changes direction. On the whole, the T-gauge flexitrack keeps its shape quite nicely. There's an element of spring back, but it's not too bad. I did add another screw though, once I was happy with the profile of the S-curve along the sea wall. At the northeast end of the board I want to model the railway as it starts to curve around towards Dawlish Warren, and for it to disappear out of view as it goes past Langstone Rock. On the real railway, that curve is quite steeply banked, which is one of the things I really like about this section of railway, though if you're sitting on a train that goes slowly or comes to a stop on this curve, it's quite uncomfortable. I drew a curve on a new piece of cork by eye. I wanted the track to ease into the curve rather than have a consistent radius. I then stuck this extra section of cork down to give the outer track a higher bed than the inner track. I didn't really pay enough attention to the edge of the board though, and after realising the track would come right up to the edge, I added a bit of extra cork inside the curve. With a higher level for the outer track, I also now had to account for a rise in height. It looked like I probably had enough of a straight section to do that before starting the curve. I then remembered that I want to have optical train detection sensors near to a signal gantry. I hope to have at least 2 aspect automatic colour signals on the layout. I'm not convinced I'll be able to achieve that at this scale, but I'm going to try and so need to have sensors. At the end of my video about ballast experiments I showed some testing with an infrared sensor, to make sure they could work with T-gauge track and trains. Before getting much further with track laying I took part of the baseboard frame out and cut a notch out of it to make space for the sensors. I had a narrow escape with my jigsaw cutting this notch. The wood and jigsaw jumped unexpectedly when I was holding the wood down, and the jigsaw blade did actually knock against my thumb knuckle hard enough to bruise it, but somehow, mercifully, only left minor scratches. So, jigsaws can jump. I'll be taking precautions accordingly in future. Back to the much safer domain of track laying. I started curving a piece of flexitrack into the approximate shape, but the rails pinged out of several of the sleeper chairs and wouldn't stay back in. That hadn't happened before. That made that section of track useless, so I cut it off, which seemed to release a lot of tension in the rail and it popped out of even more sleepers. I've always been surprised at how strong the tiny plastic chairs are that hold this track in place, but it looks like they're more fragile than I thought, and bending track needs to be done fairly gradually. Test fitting a curve of track in a banked position, it became quite clear that it would need to be held very firmly and very precisely in place. Copydex has a strong hold, but only the very edge of the sleepers would be against anything, so I doubted that would work. I haven't come across a practical solution to this. As far as I can see, the track bed itself needs to have the profile of the banking in it, and that's a fairly complex shape to make. It's essentially like part of a shallow bowl. Even with the track bed in the right profile, putting weight down evenly across most of the track for glue to dry would be difficult. I briefly considered sanding some wood to the banked curve profile, but decided against it. I didn't have the wood and didn't think the process would be very fun, so I decided to go with a flat curve. I'm disappointed not to have the banking, but I think from lots of viewing angles it probably wouldn't have been noticeable, so I'll see how it turns out without it. The extra layer of cork for the banking pulled up reasonably easily, with only a small section of the first layer needing to be replaced. The track along the sea wall needed power cables because I didn't intend to join it to the end curve with any rail joiners, and it looked like there was just about enough space for cables to come down here. If the infrared sensors don't work out, this also gives me the option to use current sensors for chain detection. In previous videos I've talked about the challenges of soldering to this track, and I've kindly been given lots of advice from people, mainly on the first of those videos. Having had success with experiments many months ago, I was expecting it to be more straightforward than it ended up being, but on this track it took lots of attempts and I got quite frustrated in the process, so I didn't film it all. Getting a reasonable shot of what's happening adds to the difficulty and frustration. You can see quite a bit of damage to sleepers here. I think that was caused more by the solder running up against the sleepers, rather than the soldering iron touching the sleepers or heat from the rail. The damage doesn't look too bad from the other side, so I decided it would be okay and there was no need to start over with a new piece of track. I waited to see exactly where I could attach the cables before drilling any holes for them in the base. Next up was one of the easiest steps, sticking the track in place with Computex. Although it can be messy, I like this part. After a few minutes the glue is quite tacky and has quite a strong hold, so it's possible to make little adjustments to the track alignment. Where I wanted the track to stay straight for joining to other sections, I used temporary screws. Note that where the track reaches the end of the board I left some overhang with the rails. That's because as the track is bent the rails slide within the sleepers, so you don't know exactly where they're going to end up until it's all permanently fixed in place. That wasn't particularly necessary in this case though, because the power cables soldered to the rails are wedged pretty tightly between sleepers, so the rails are unlikely to slide in that area. Once happy with the shape, I added some evenly distributed weight to as much of the track as I could and left it to dry overnight. Looking at it the next day, I wasn't entirely happy with the profile of the curve. I should have made the middle section more curvy. Overall, it looks a bit like a curve, a fairly straight bit, and then another curve. But it's not so bad that I was willing to take it up and try gluing again. To prepare for alignment with the next section of track, I cut some rail away from the end of a deliberately straight section, being careful to leave the sleepers and rail chairs in place undamaged. I needed a decent length of track to get all the way around the turn at the end of the layout without track joints, so I got a fresh piece of 70cm long track and this time bent it into shape more gradually. Once happy, I cut off enough sleepers from the end for the track to slide onto the sleepers from the other section of rail. In this instance, it just happened that I didn't need to trim the end off the rails, but I did need to do quite a bit of filing on the ones I did cut. The track cutters hadn't done a very clean job on this occasion. I glued and screwed the start of the curve in place. I wanted an accurate alignment between the two sections of rail, so I left it with extra weight on it for a couple of hours before coming back to glue the rest of the curve. After all the handling to get the track joining section done, I needed to do a bit of reprofiling on the curve. I wasn't too worried about the half of the curve at the back of the layout. That's not intended to be visible from normal viewing. The curve had looked okay to me at the time, but yet again I wasn't all that pleased with it the next day. I've got the apex of the curve too far towards the front of the layout, and the curve had some gentle kinks in it. I actually think what I ended up with in the non-scenic section is a much nicer profile. But, yet again, after the effort of getting it this far, I'm not willing to undo and start again. The overall alignment of the tracks at the two sections seemed to look good though, so I decided it was time to test both the power cables and the track alignment, so fetched the HST. It had been quite a while since its last outing. The track needed some cleaning and the loco needed to be going quite fast to work, but this did at least demonstrate the power cables were soldered to the track well enough. The loco really didn't like the track join though, and was lifting significantly when going over it. The gap between rails had ended up much larger than I was expecting, and compared with the size of the loco's wheels, it's a gigantic gap, but I wasn't too worried about that at the time. In my early experiments, I had been able to push the rails from the other end to slide them along the sleepers. That didn't work this time. Over the full 70 centimeters and around a 180-degree turn, there was just too much resistance. I kept increasing the force, but in the end the track buckled rather than the rails slide. So, gigantic gaps are here to stay. Whilst I'm talking about glaring problems, I do intend to tidy up that sleeper that's been mangled by the temporary screw. I think that happened because I forced the screw in without drilling a pilot hole for it, and it must have slipped sideways in the process. On a more positive note, I noticed the HST power car wasn't derailing as soon as it crossed the join. It was when it was at least a centimetre over it, and on closer inspection I found there was a translucent blob of copydex against one of the rails. Once I'd pulled that off, the loco started crossing the gap okay. It was still very prone to stalling, so I think once this is all ballasted I'm going to need to give the rails a very thorough clean, and maybe check the cleanliness of the loco's wheels too. For the next section of track along the front, I just about had enough overhang in the plywood for dropper wires, but it was tight. I marked exactly where I'd need to attach the wires and drill the hole. To my frustration, the rails popped out of the sleepers at the end of this section of track, even though I was being gentle with handling it. I think this is essentially because the flexitrack has a corkscrew twist to it for some reason. I decided to check some more lengths to see if any were actually flat. They weren't. There must be something about the way these are manufactured that leaves a twisting tension in the rails. I then also had a problem with one of the tiny screws. The cross in its head disintegrated when I was trying to unscrew it. This was frustrating, but I think it's very likely because I didn't drill a pilot hole for this one and instead pushed down hard on it when screwing it in. It seems pilot holes are necessary. I managed to remove it with a flat screw. My first round of attempts to solder dropper wires to this track didn't work, and at this point, with the other things I've mentioned that hadn't worked out as I'd hoped, I was starting to get very frustrated. I left things for a while and came back to it later and had more success. To recap from previous videos about the soldering, the metal in this rail is steel, which is different to the N-gauge track I've worked with and has different requirements. As is always the case, the rails need a bit of filing to give more grip to the solder. The flux I've got is acid-based, which is necessary for cutting through surface oxides on the steel, and this solder has a bit of silver in it. I had also switched to a more powerful soldering iron that has a temperature display and had it set to 400 degrees Celsius. After buying all that stuff, I had plenty of comments from people with various helpful suggestions, the most tempting of which was an electrically conductive glue, but I decided to use what I'd already bought since I'd had success with it in my experiments. I eventually succeeded in getting wires soldered to this rail. The biggest help was to make 3 times more space on the rail by removing one sleeper. Otherwise, the gap between sleepers is just too small to work in, and the molten solder ends up flowing up to the sleepers and melting them. My soldering iron tip seemed clean to me, and I was cleaning it on the wire mesh regularly, but I noticed solder wasn't actually melting near the end of it. So I applied some tip tinner and that revived it, allowing me to work with more precision. Not having melted sleeper mixed with the solder probably helped too. I also switched back to a finer wire. I can't remember what I'd been trying to use, but it wasn't as fine as what I'd used on the first section of rail. I don't know its gauge, but the stuff that worked is labelled as ultra-fine decoder wire. To dissipate heat in the rails, to help keep the sleepers from being damaged, I placed the track on strips of brass when soldering. The brass warmed up, so that technique seems to do the job, and it leaves lots of freedom for manoeuvring the track. I've kept the sleeper I cut out. Once I get to ballasting, I'll glue bits of it back in place, hopefully without any obvious sign it was ever removed. Gluing this track down seemed straightforward, though yet again, once dried I noticed imperfections that I hadn't noticed when positioning it. I don't seem to have managed as smooth a curve this time, and haven't managed to keep a consistent distance from the other track. I didn't try to use any kind of jig for keeping a consistent distance because the track would just spring out of place as soon as I moved the jig along. From what I think will be normal viewing distances and angles, I don't think these flaws are going to be glaringly obvious. The process for the rest of the track laying was pretty similar, but before installing the inner curve I ran a Mark III coach along the outer curve to check its overhang. It was minimal and showed I didn't need to increase the gap between the lines around the curve. One minor difference in my approach this time was to dispense with the little screws. I put the copydex in place and left it for several minutes to become quite tacky. For the most part that worked, but not at the join with the other track. It's ended up with a slight kink. Back at the other end of the board, with the S-curve tracks both in place, I trimmed the ends. I was pleased that the rails for the up line stay level, even though the sleeper chairs there don't grip the rail. It seems that with the rest of the rail held level by the glue it's okay, so the corkscrew tension must be mostly away from the end of the rail. I didn't film the remaining bits of track laying, but it's worth mentioning that the power at the back of the layout will be hidden from view, so I decided I can solder power cables to the outside of the rails sometime later. Because of sleepers being glued down, the outer track has another join using just sleepers for alignment, whereas on the inner track I was able to use metal track joiners to reduce the number of cables I need to solder on. I didn't notice when doing the join, but those tracks don't look properly aligned, so I might need to lift it there and do some realigning. I've yet to run a train again on most of the track though, so I'll do that first to see if fixes are needed anywhere. So, that was quite a lot of time and effort just to get a couple of half loops of track down, and it's not even finished yet. As ever, my main interest remains with N-gauge, but it's nice to have got a bit further towards bringing the Dawlish T Wall to life. That's all for now. Bye bye!